My name is Julia LaPalme. I am a writer and photographer specializing in automotive and motorcycles. I've been working in the industry for about 14 or 15 years now. I would say I've been a bit of a car enthusiast to certain degrees for over 20 years and a motorcycle enthusiast for about 15 years. I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie and think I probably like motorcycles a little more than cars. But yeah, it's all fun.
It's all fun. We do it for all the fun.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Well, it's funny because this is a car podcast, but you're primarily into motorcycles.
Well, I think personally, when it comes to being at the helm of a vehicle, my preference is motorcycles. I get a much bigger thrill from riding a motorcycle than driving a car. But when it comes to photography, I actually really enjoy photographing cars because there's a lot more sheet metal, and I view them as sculptures on wheels. So, yeah. So I get a little bit of both. I get to write about motorcycles and, photograph cars, and yeah, it's fun.
Southern California native, not Southern California native. Tell me the story.
I'm a Bay Area native, so I was born and raised in San Jose. And my dad lived up in San Francisco, so I'd visit him on the weekends, and he was realistically my earliest car influence. We would go on road trips every summer to go visit his family out in the Midwest, and inevitably we would see cars on the road that he'd point out, or we'd go and visit a car show while we'd be out in Wisconsin, and I took a liking to cars in large part because of him. It's like, oh, Dad's into that, so I want to be into that, So he was easily my earliest influence, but later on, when I was in high school, my high school sweetheart was a huge car nut, and that was probably one of my bigger car influences. So yeah, I lived in the Bay Area until I was about 13 and moved to Colorado. And I was in Colorado all through my high school years, and then met my high school sweetheart, who was the car fanatic. Got married right out of high school. He was in the Army. We moved down to Texas. Yep. So there, lots of moving around.
Lots of different places for car people.
But yeah, I would say the earliest memory I have of actually feeling some kind of car lust was actually for the original Ford Bronco.
Okay.
I was leafing through one of the car magazines at my high school sweetheart's house and came across what I think was a B.F. Goodrich ad, and it was a scene that was almost completely green, and except for the tires, which were like this really beautiful, rich black. The car that they used in that ad was an early, first gen Ford Bronco, and I said, "What is that? I want one."
Okay.
And my boyfriend was telling me he was a big Jeep CJ7 fan at the time, and so he was just like, "Oh yeah, that's a Ford Bronco." And my parents were a lot more sensible about that sort of thing. They were not. Neither my mom nor my stepdad were big car people at all. And they almost forbade me from buying anything Jeep-shaped. So I never got my Ford Bronco, but that's my earliest memory of actually suddenly feeling like an emotional reaction to a car. And so, yeah, I became interested in cars, a little bit to have something in common with my boyfriend, who then turned into my husband, who unfortunately is now my ex-husband. But, these are all experiences that we have that shape our lives.
Sure.
So after living in Colorado, we moved to Texas where he was stationed, and I started working at a newspaper in Austin, Texas. And I had worked as a photographer at a local newspaper that was near the Fort Hood where he was based. And I had transferred to a job at the Austin American-Statesman, and I was working in the photography department there. And I realized that newspaper photography wasn't for me anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I really, pie in the sky, would have loved to have worked for National Geographic, but a step down from that would be, I want to work for magazines. I don't want to work for newspapers anymore. I don't want to photograph the car wrecks and the house fires and, the city hall meetings.
Sure.
I want to do magazine photography. And one of the staff photographers pointed me in the direction of Brooks Institute of Photography, which used to be based in Santa Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
It has since shut down only a couple years ago. So one thing led to another. I applied. I was accepted. And I got to move back to my home state of California, which made me immensely happy.
Yeah. To Santa Barbara as well.
To Santa Barbara,
not
which
a bad
is
place to move. Yeah.
It's like it is absolute paradise. So I lived the dream it was a 3-year school. I didn't take any summer breaks, so I just went straight through and got my bachelor's degree in commercial advertising photography with a focus on cars. So I had a car photography class while I was at Brooks. And during that class, the senior photographer from Motor Trend magazine came to speak to our class. And he, most of our education was talking about advertising photography. And our teacher he had specialized in advertising photography. So he was talking about the techniques of photographing cars from an advertising standpoint. So we were learning about some of these really big budgets and some of these techniques to prep the car so that you could get the shot mostly in camera, because we were learning mostly on film and slide film when I was in school. We didn't start shooting digital until I think my 3rd year of school.
Mm-hmm.
And so we weren't talking a lot about the Photoshop techniques. We were talking about like the real world kind of special effects techniques, And yet during this class that was all focused on advertising automotive photography, here comes in this editorial automotive photographer from Motor Trend magazine. And of course, all of us knew Motor Trend magazine. And he gave us a lecture talking about the joys of editorial photography, of editorial automotive photography.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly, like a light just kind of went on and everything to me felt like it clicked. And the way he was describing his job and what he got to do and how much travel he got to do, and the access that he got to different cars and going to different events, and it just sounded super exciting to me. While I was in college, I had actually started shooting some rally photography for a local rally called the Rim of the World Rally that was based out of Palmdale.
Mm-hmm.
And, this was at a time before I'd actually been published. And so I called up the organizers of the Rim of the World Rally and convinced them to give me a full access pass in exchange for my photos. So I essentially became their official event photographer. I did that 2 years in a row. So I'd already gotten my taste for the thrill of photographing really exciting car events, like racing events.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the photography that I got from those events, definitely went into my portfolio, which I then showed to the senior photographer, and one thing led to another, and suddenly I was at an internship at Motor Trend after graduating from college.
You were in Austin, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you've already started to work as a photographer for this newspaper.
Yeah.
Now take me back to when the camera actually got into your hands.
So I picked up photography my senior year in high school.
Mm-hmm.
I had some friends that were working on the yearbook and newspaper class, and up until that point, I thought I was going to major in music. I was in the choir. I was in a 24-person a cappella choir called the Madrigals. I was competing at state level. I was going to sing and play piano, and I was going to be some performing artist. And then I got a camera in my hands, and suddenly everything changed. I was spending hours upon hours after school getting lost in the dark room and learning to develop my own black and white film, develop and print my own black and white prints.
Sure.
And learning to piece together a newspaper and a yearbook in the old-fashioned way of
Right.
like literally cutting and pasting pictures and text onto a piece of paper that we would then send to the printer. And it was a fascinating process for me, and I really bonded with my fellow journalism classmates. And the journalism teacher was, aside from my music teacher, I think he was one of my favorite teachers. He was pretty young, so I think he was a lot more relatable than most of my other teachers. And he was just a funny, easygoing guy. And all my classmates liked him. And it was just it was a different world for me. It was a slightly different world than, the one that I had gotten used to with music and theater and all of that. And I really I enjoyed it. I kind of enjoyed being behind the scenes. So up until that point, I'd sort of been priming myself to be some sort of performing artist, whether it was a musician or, an actor on stage. And suddenly there was like this different outlet of creativity and this different way to kind of lose myself without having to be in the spotlight. And and like I said, I think National Geographic was one of the biggest influences to me early on. And I had dreams of shooting for them one day. And then one thing led to another. Obviously, I got kind of sidetracked.
Sure, a little bit.
into automotive. And I think, ultimately when I did go to college for photography, what I loved about automotive, aside from being able to view cars as these sculptures on wheels, was that they allowed me to integrate all sorts of different avenues of photography too. So, whether it's a car or a motorcycle, you still need somebody piloting that vehicle.
Sure.
So inevitably there's going to be some people photography element of it. You're either going to shoot in the studio, or more likely than not, you're going to be shooting out on location. So that gives me the opportunity to incorporate landscape and nature photography and architectural photography, whether I'm shooting in the city or, way out in the desert or up in the mountains. So, and I was raised as someone who just really enjoys the outdoors. And so the opportunity to make my full-time job as something where I get to be creative and I get to be outdoors all the time. And I get a little bit of an adrenaline rush, even when I'm standing on the side of the road and I get to watch a car go by, especially when they're doing something really fun, like drifting or doing burnouts or, doing some gnarly jump during a rally stage, that's exciting to me. That's so thrilling to me. And the idea of capturing those images is, it is still an adrenaline rush for me.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a nice way. I sort of came to that decision of focusing on automotive in a somewhat logical path, but also, through an emotional decision as well.
Sure.
So
during the time that you were in Austin, car love, were you, as you were photographing, whatever it is that you were photographing, bad news, we'll say.
Sure.
Austin is a car city. There's some really great rat rods there and hot rods, and
Sure.
Austin's a great city, period.
Yeah.
But were you trying to kind of take photos of cars on the side, or was that not?
I wasn't really focusing on that yet, but before we moved to Austin, I bought a 1969 Volkswagen Carmen Ghia.
Okay.
So the poor man's Porsche. And I adored that car. And so there were many times where I would take photos of that car, or I'd go out with the Volkswagen Club for a drive and I would take photos of those cars. But unless it was like a car show that was my assignment for the newspaper, I never really kind of connected my aspirations for photography as a career and cars as an interest. Like that hadn't quite clicked for me yet. Yeah, they were still separate things.
Tell me about this Rim of the World rally. Was the experience everything that you wanted it to be?
Originally, I had approached them because I wanted to watch the rally. My ex-husband was a huge WRC fan. I can't remember if I think we'd already purchased a Subaru WRX at that time, and he was specking that out. He had, rally driving aspirations, which never came to fruition, but that's beside the point. But, we had our own little WRC kind of specced out WRX, and so we were familiar with like WRC level rally. So let's see him drift through the gravel around the corner. We want to see those big gnarly jumps. And we're used to seeing tons of people watch from the side of the road. These are on the European stages of the European rallies. It's not as litigious. So, people can get away with a lot more. People understand the risks of watching rally from the sidelines. But, in the US, it's a much different experience. So they had specific areas set aside for spectators. And once I learned where those spectator areas were, I was incredibly disappointed. And that's when I approached them. I said, I would really love to get like full access pass. Like I want to be able to, travel along the course, get myself set up, obviously pull my car way far off the course and get myself set up so I can get some more interesting photos, because these spectator points are not interesting. I mean, they're going to get boring after a while if that's the only area you're going to give me access to. I would really love to get, something more interesting.
Got it.
So, it was a ton of fun. And if I remember correctly, the time of year that we were doing Rim of the World Rally was around spring. So the hillsides and the wilderness around Palmdale and kind of in the hills there near, I think it was near Lake Elizabeth maybe, and then some areas up off of Angeles Forest Highway as well. They were gorgeous. Everything was green and in bloom, and it felt like a completely different world, very far removed from Los Angeles or Santa Barbara, and this was far before I'd moved to Los Angeles, so I wasn't quite, familiar with the geography and how close those areas were to LA, but it was an amazing experience. I actually met Ken Block for the first time during those years.
Very cool.
And he was in a WRX that I remember it had a like a gray and white urban camo paint scheme, and I had no idea who Ken Block was.
Nobody at that time did.
I had no idea who he was. I had no idea who he was even associated with DC.
Sure.
So like I approached him and I was just like, dude, I really love the paint scheme on your car. This is really cool. And he just kind of looks at me and he's like, thanks. Glad you approve. And I was just this young college kid. I didn't know any better, but it was a lot of fun. And, I didn't get a ride along with Ken, but one of the other rally drivers, because I was categorized into the field of journalists. So I was able to get sort of a journalist ride along for one of the stages. And it was amazing. It was so much fun. I could just tell that these guys had full control of their car, even when we were just drifting and kind of floating through these gravel areas. I had full confidence in their abilities.
Wow.
And my ex-husband was a bit of an aggressive driver already, so I think that had kind of like
Got it. Yeah, like
numbed
this is
my
nothing.
senses.
Right.
I was already just like, "Yep, I got a stomach of steel. Like you can't make me car sick."
Right.
So,
I don't even need an oh shit handle at this point.
No, not at all. I mean, I was holding my cameras trying to photograph them while we were driving, so I wasn't even necessarily looking through the windscreen when we did those ride-alongs. I was trying to photograph through my camera, so. A lot of times it was just the G-forces that might keep me from keeping my face up to the camera. But yeah, it was fun. Like I said, I was a bit of an adrenaline junkie. So I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And being able to do that 2 years in a row was a lot of fun.
So let's get a little bit further into the professional career and, tell me the story of like how things progressed from that rally on to where we are today.
Oh, okay. Well, so I was still in college when I was shooting the Rim of the World Rally, so I was beefing up my portfolio with, trying to incorporate cars into every single assignment that I had in college, and I think it was my third year in college, my third and final year in college, that I took an automotive photography class. And it was taught by a man named Harry Lyles, who was a fairly experienced advertising automotive photographer, and he had a lot of connections with some full-time working advertising automotive photographers. And like I said before, he was teaching us a lot of techniques of how to photograph a car for an ad client for an advertising campaign. And like I said, I was doing this rally thing on the side. I was trying to incorporate cars into every single assignment that I had. And then I took this car photography class, and, I was surrounded by fellow wannabe car photographers, and I hit it off really well with my teacher. He and I we had a good sense of humor with each other, banter, and he would joke about my gray hair. I'd already been graying at that point. I got some gray hairs pretty early on. So he would joke and call me salt and pepper. And I was just like, look in the mirror, old man. Like, who you talking to? Like, so we would just banter with each other. So we had a pretty good relationship. And, I kind of looked up, and he was a sort of a father figure, and he seemed to take to me. And I had already started riding a motorcycle at that point. My final year in college, I got my motorcycle license, and suddenly it was just like I was addicted to motorcycles, and I was addicted to riding. So I started riding my motorcycle to class, and so I would talk bikes with my teacher too, and so yeah, he and I had a pretty good rapport, and then when the senior photographer from Motor Trend, his name was John Kiewicks, and eventually I learned that we called him Kiwi, short for Kiewicks. And so when Kiwi came to my automotive photography class, he talked to us about the editorial side of automotive photography, which was this whole different world. A lot smaller budgets, a lot faster timelines, but a lot of adventures and a lot of travel. And here I was being trained as a commercial advertising photographer, but I already had this background in newspaper photography. I already had this experience of photographing some really high speed motorsports photography, and during that automotive photography class, we were making trips up to Willow Springs and taking photos during the races, and getting access to some pretty interesting cars up there too, some awesome club racing. And so when John Kiewicks came to speak to my class, and he started talking about Motor Trend's internship program, and that really piqued my interest. I was like, yes, I want to do that. I want to work for the magazines. And, this tied into my earlier aspirations before I'd gone to college, but suddenly it was a lot more focused. It was like, automotive magazine photography. Yes. So I spoke to him and spoke to my teacher, and, he said, well, just turn in a portfolio to your teacher, and, and he'll turn in his favorites from the class, and then we'll go from there. And so I had a pretty strong portfolio, along with a few other classmates. So I didn't feel like I was a total ringer for the internship, but I wanted it, and I wanted it badly. And so the minute I turned my portfolio in, and then of course I started bugging my teacher, like, hey, so what have you heard from John? Hey, have you heard from Kiwis yet? Hey, what's the latest? And finally he was just sick of me pestering him. So he was just like, you email him. Like, here's his email address. So then I started pestering Kiwicks. Hey, so what's the latest? So when's the next internship opening up? Hey, so how's it going? And so he invited me down to Motor Trend's offices, which were located on Wilshire Boulevard at the time, at the old Peterson Tower, Peterson offices, which were really close to the Peterson Automotive Museum.
Okay.
And
like the Miracle Mile area?
Yes,
okay, got
exactly. Yeah, it was like a 19-story building.
Okay.
And so that building was owned by the Peterson family. And so even though by the time I ended up making it to Motor Trend, they were no longer owned by the Peterson company. At that point, they were owned by Prime Media. So Kiewicks invited me down to the Wilshire office, and I was to be going in for my official interview for this internship. And I decided to ride my motorcycle. I was still living up in Santa Barbara at the time. And so I rode my motorcycle down to West LA, and that was a harrowing experience. Suddenly I was facing LA traffic, right? And totally different experience from Santa Barbara traffic,
Sure.
And it was nerve-wracking, but I made it down there, and showing up on a motorcycle made a really strong impression. And it turned out that John Kiewicks was also a motorcyclist. And so we had that bond immediately. And so we started talking bikes a little bit, and I was still a fairly new rider at the time, so I didn't know a lot about a lot of bikes. I knew a fair amount of my bike, and I knew that I loved riding.
Mm-hmm.
So, but he was fairly impressed, and I remember one of the questions he asked was, "So, you ride a motorcycle? Can I assume that you know how to drive stick?" I'm like, "Heck yeah, I can drive stick with my hands or my feet. Like, which way? Like, how do you want to do this?" So yeah, I made a pretty strong impression, and my portfolio was strong, and and persistence is key, and I kept bugging him and letting him know that I was still interested. So, after my interview, I had gone ahead and graduated, and even though there was no guarantee of that internship, I still didn't have the internship nailed yet. My husband at the time and I moved down to Glendale just to be closer, just to be in the greater LA area, and Glendale was where we found him a job. So yeah, we moved down to the LA area with no promise of a job or even an internship for me. I was just like living on a hope and a prayer.
Sure.
Working at Home Depot at the time. I worked at Home Depot all through my college years. They were pretty flexible with schedules. They had a fairly reasonable tuition reimbursement program, which was
really
nice.
okay.
Yeah,
That's good to know.
and I was able to. Well, at the time, I don't know if it's still going on, but I was able to convince them that commercial advertising photography was totally eligible for a Home Depot tuition reimbursement because look at all of your ads. They include photos. How do you expect the photography to get taken, without a commercial advertising photographer knowing how to do studio photography of that lawnmower and that shovel and those plants and like all that stuff, all the lumber and all the stuff that you sell at Home Depot, the tools. And yeah, so I was kind of an exception in that department, but it was a decent job to have through college, and it allowed me to transfer from Santa Barbara down to Glendale. So here I was working at this menial retail job at Home Depot in Glendale, just keeping my fingers crossed for something, anything. Like I was applying for assistant jobs with automotive photographers, and I even remember calling up a motorcycle magazine based up in this area called Rider Magazine. And I spoke to their editor at the time, who's still their editor today. And, and I had zero work published at the time.
Sure.
So I was still just trying to get my foot in the door anywhere and still hadn't heard back about this Motor Trend internship. And I talked to their editor, Mark at the time, and he was just like, well, if you don't have anything really published yet, I can't really say I can give you something, but yeah, I'll keep you in mind. Just kind of
right.
Just the friendly little brush off, right?
Right. Yeah, of course.
And I did a couple stints with as an assistant for a couple of days for a few different automotive photographers, but I was just really holding on to the hope for that Motor Trend internship, and eventually I finally heard back, and they were ready to accept me. They offered me the internship, and that was the big break for me. I was just beside myself, elated that I got it. And, thankfully it was a paid internship. I mean, I think I was only making $250 a week, working, as a photography assistant, a driver for photo shoots. I would clean the cars. I would take the cars over to the car wash for the editors. I was helping in every way possible as the intern.
Sure.
And, yeah, it was an amazing experience. And about 4 months into that internship, Angus McKenzie, who was the editor-in-chief at the time, he pulled me into his office and he said, "How would you like to work for us full-time?"
Wow.
And I said, "Are you kidding me? Absolutely. I would love that." And he says, "Okay, I just got to shift a few things around and we got to make some room for you. And yeah, so just hang tight. Like, don't go anywhere. Just hang tight." I hung tight for a year.
Really?
By the time they finally brought me on staff, I'd been interning for almost a year and a half.
Huh.
Yeah, it was just, it was a tumultuous time. So I graduated in college in late 2005. My internship started at Motor Trend January 2006. So this was mid 2007 when I nailed a staff position.
That makes sense.
The numbers were already starting to decline for, sales and magazines. Like, the decline was already kind of coming, right?
Yeah, I call it the oh shit period.
The oh shit period, absolutely. But somehow they made room for me, and I clung to that job, and I was so grateful when that first wave of layoffs came, not long after I was hired, that I was spared, and it probably helped that I was the lowest paid person on the staff, and I was essentially working as an editorial assistant, working at the front desk essentially, but with a photo degree.
Yeah.
So they were using me as not just a staff photographer, but still as an assistant on other photo shoots. But I would go out to the track and help run the test computer. I'd help the test team with their stuff. I was just kind of an all around, like, throw me wherever you need me, right? I'm just like, and then finally they gave me my first assignment, and that was so exciting. And it was like the Hyundai Sonata, I think, and I was just like, okay, like, no offense, but like, this is such a boring car, but I'm super stoked to get an assignment all of myself. So.
Right.
So yeah, I tried to make it as interesting as possible, with a less interesting car, but it made a good impression. And every time that they handed me a car for assignment, I poured everything into it. And, and I don't like tooting my own horn, but I think I was shaking things up a little bit. I was coming in with a commercial advertising degree. I had a pretty strong education in studio lighting. And so I think I was starting to elevate the level of photography for them, at least coming from their staff photographers. And, I was having a blast. I was absolutely having a blast. And, it didn't matter to me if it was one car or four cars, or if we were, staying on pavement or going off-roading, or, whatever we were doing. It was one adventure after another, and it was amazing. So yeah, when Angus pulled me into his office, and told me that he wanted me to join the staff, I was super stoked. So yeah, and then I stuck around that job for almost 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a long time.
Yeah.
Especially in print.
Yeah, I know.
Especially in journalism.
I know it.
It seems like everybody kind of jumps from one boat to another.
Yeah. Yeah, and there were a fair number of changes of hands within staff. A few people leaving, and then a couple new people showing up to replace them. But yeah, those of us on the photo team, we were sticking it out. I think I knew what I had was a rare thing, and especially after 2008 hit, we were hearing more stories about magazine after magazine just completely canning all of their staff photographers. And eventually over the years we were hearing newspapers were starting to whittle down their staff photographers. It was nerve-wracking, so I was always kind of keeping an eye out, like, when's the next wave of layoffs gonna hit me? And it never did, thankfully.
So 10 years after that, what happened?
Well, with as much fun as I was having with the cars and the adventures, I was starting to get a little burned out. Things were becoming a little formulaic, and I could tell I needed a change of pace. And all the while I was working at Motor Trend, almost within the first month or two, I took the elevator up to the 17th floor and made friends with the folks at the motorcycle magazines. I introduced myself to the editor-in-chief at Motorcyclist and the editor-in-chief at Sport Rider, and I got to know the staff up there. And so anytime I could get away with it, anytime I could sneak in some kind of help or photography little photography work that I could do with those guys, I would. I just wanted to let them know, hey, I'm a fellow motorcyclist. I'm just a few floors away. Like, I would love to help you guys out. Anytime you need a photographer, anytime you need a rider for a photo shoot, anytime I can help in any way, I would really love to contribute to your magazine. So, Motorcyclist magazine had already changed hands a couple of times after, around the time that I was really starting to, I was looking for other avenues. I think ideally I would have wanted to go freelance, but I just didn't feel ready for that yet. For whatever reason, I just didn't feel ready to go freelance. I didn't feel ready to go out on my own yet. And Mark Cook had become the editor-in-chief at Motorcyclist at the time. And he and I hit it off pretty immediately. Like, we had a similar philosophy. Like, he was a pretty chill, down-to-earth person, not a ton of ego. And, there wasn't, like, I never ever got any sense of, like, kind of sexist attitude from him. He was just like, totally like, that's rad. You ride. I'm so glad, like, awesome. Like, we'll let you know anytime we need help with anything. And so I'd go over to his office and shoot the shit. And at one point, suddenly, I heard the news that Source Interlink, who is now the parent company of Motor Trend and Hot Rod and all those other titles, they were selling off all the motorcycle magazines. So, Motorcyclist, Sport Rider, Dirt Rider, Hot Bike, all these motorcycle magazines, they were selling off to Bonnier. And the minute I heard the news, I went straight over to Mark's office and I said, take me with you. I think as much as I enjoyed automotive photography, I was more of a motorcycle person, and I felt more at home having conversations with motorcycle people. They were just a little bit more down to earth, and I don't know. There was just they felt like more of my tribe, and so I rushed over there and take me with you, and Mark was like, okay, well, let me see if Bonnier will give us some budget for a staff photographer, and I'll let you know. And and eventually everybody, moved out of the Motor Trend offices, and all the bike books left the Motor Trend offices and moved down to Irvine, and I kept in touch with them a little bit here and there, and we would go on some weekend rides together here and there, and so I was like, hey, so do you ever find out anything about, maybe a staff photographer position? He was like, no, unfortunately, they're not going to give us the budget for it. I'm like, dang it. All right. But maybe a year or so after Motorcyclist was bought by Bonnier, I got a phone call from Mark while I was up in Monterey during Monterey Car Week. And I was at the Quail, and I got a phone call from Mark saying, hey, we've got a position opening up on staff, and I want to see if you're interested. I was like, sweet. Did you finally get budget for staff photographer? And he says, nope, it's a writing position.
Interesting.
So I was like, what? Okay. So we chatted about it a bit, and I was just like, okay, well, you realize that my degree is in photography, so that's my strong suit. But I was a fairly good English student back in high school. I enjoyed writing, but I'm maybe a little out of practice. I had some long-term vehicles while I was on staff at Motor Trend, so I'd have to write a monthly 500-word long-term vehicle update. But that was essentially the extent of my writing while I was on staff at Motor Trend. I think at one point I did do a travel story for Truck Trend. I borrowed a Range Rover and drove it around Ireland, and then told this Truck Trend story. But
very cool.
But aside from my long-term vehicle updates, I think the editors at Motor Trend didn't really consider my writing worthy of publication. So I was a photographer. I needed to know my place.
Sure.
So the fact that Mark saw potential in me and was willing to give me a chance to sort of stretch my legs and learn a new skill set it was an amazing opportunity. And it was a very, very difficult decision to make, even with as kind of burned out and ready to move on as I was. I was also very comfortable at
Sure.
Motor Trend. These were people that I'd been working with for almost a decade. And this was, I had a rhythm and a flow there. I knew the process of, when Car of the Year was and when the car show season came and went and
Right.
how these assignments worked. And, I was getting some pretty amazing assignments, getting to go on some pretty epic drives, overseas. And I had it pretty good at Motor Trend, but, I just needed something different. But it was a very, very difficult decision for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so I hemmed and hawed over it for quite some time before I finally realized I really needed to shake something up for myself. I really needed a change. And there were many tears shed over that decision, to be honest. But ultimately, I decided to leave Motor Trend, and I joined the staff of Motorcyclist Magazine as their associate editor. And yeah, talk about a whole different set of doors that were open and a whole different industry that suddenly I was exposed to. And I was being taken a lot more seriously as a contributor to the motorcycling world. And it was an amazing shift in responsibility and skills, and going from a staff of 30 some odd people to a staff of like 5.
Wow, that little.
And suddenly I had to I realized that I was going to have to wear a lot more hats.
Sure.
I was going to have my fingers in the magazine making process a lot more. I was going to have to understand the publishing schedule a lot better. And when I was a staff photographer, I was a little bit removed from all that real hands-on understanding when the first set of stories were due, and there was a week of editing that needed to happen and trimming down and all of this stuff, all this process that you go through with a magazine.
Mm-hmm.
So suddenly I was having to realize that hands-on as a writer, as a contributor. And that was, like I said, a whole new world for me.
Okay. It's exciting.
Yeah.
Nerve-wracking and exciting.
Super nerve-wracking.
But now you're here.
So yeah, now I'm here. I was on staff at Motorcyclist for about 2.5 years. My boss, Mark Cook, ended up having to leave for various reasons about a year after I started. And that was a bit heartbreaking. But after he left, there was a big shift on staff. And, they asked me if I still wanted to be an editor. And I was just like, oh, I don't know. I'd love to, I think I'm missing the photography. I'd really love to do something a little more photo related. So I became the photo editor. And that that lasted for a good year and a half, maybe. And then suddenly it became apparent that not only is print, I don't want to say print is dying, but print is dwindling, but the motorcycle industry was suffering as well. So motorcycle magazines were taking a double hit.
Yeah.
And sadly, there were layoffs at Motorcyclist, and eventually that affected me. And so last year, January of 2018, I was laid off. And that was a really really jarring experience. Suddenly I'd been on staff at a magazine for 13, 14 years at that point.
Yeah.
And suddenly I was on my own. And I've been freelancing since last January, and much to my surprise, it has been going incredibly well. So much better than I think I ever could have imagined. And I think, the fact that I've been working in both the automotive and the motorcycle industry now, a combined amount of, 13 or 14 years, means that I have a lot of contacts throughout both industries.
Sure.
And I had a lot of people reaching out to me almost immediately, like within the hour of the news breaking that I had lost my job. I was getting phone calls and texts. People were reaching out saying, hey, you need some work, pitch us some stories. We'll keep you in mind for photo stuff. Like, it was amazing, the outreach. throughout the motorcycling industry, and then eventually through the automotive industry as well. And so between those two, and suddenly I had this skill set of writing under my belt too. And within the motorcycling world, I was being taken more seriously as a writer. Whereas in the car world, I was still seen as just a photographer. But suddenly I had this dual set of skills, and it has carried me through. I've been freelancing full time since last January, and I could not be happier. It's working out amazingly.
Perfect.
Yeah.
It's very good.
So here I am.
Yeah.
long story to get me to where I am now. But
That's a great story, though.
Yeah.
And one of my favorite sayings is everything happens for a reason.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
you're enjoying freelancing. You've got both things that you can dabble your kind of feet in, the automotive and the motorcycle world. And it sounds like you're happy.
I am very happy.
What I would like for you to do is I would like for you to plug whatever it is that you need to plug, want to plug, because people should find you, because your photography is stellar, your words are stellar, and I can't wait to see what else you've got up your sleeve.
Thank you.
Although you're sleeveless right now.
I'm sleeveless.
But,
I'm just about sleeveless right now.
Yeah.
Yes.
Please take this opportunity.
So you can find me on Instagram at Julia LaPalme, JuliaLapalme. My website, julialapalme.com, which sadly isn't updated as often as Instagram. I have an upcoming photography coming up in the next issue of Motorcyclist magazine. I currently have a feature on Royal Enfield in Iron and Air magazine. I have a cover story that I think should be coming out for Automobile magazine relatively soon. So these are some of the places you can find some of my work. And I believe I even have a story coming out on Road and Track's website soon about the Vanderhall Venice Speedster.
Very nice.
So those are a few of the more recent things I've been working on. So that's where you can find my most recent work. But that's where you can find me.
The Road Stories podcast is recorded and edited by me, Michael Senderovich. If you like the show, please leave me a review wherever you listen. It helps the show greatly. And finally, please follow me on Instagram at Road Stories Mike. Thanks so much for listening.